Okay. So what I thought we'd do this week is sort of have a run through of the various aspects of the application process that we're going to be trying to help prepare you for. So it's going to be a lot of information from me basically this week. In later sessions, it will be more interactive to give you a chance to start working on these things. But today is largely going to be a sort of lecture to sort of make sure that you know about all of these things so that you're ready for what's to come. So these are the aspects that we're going to talk about. And all of these things are going to be important in making sure that you're competitive when it comes to applying for either medicine or dentistry. So GCSE is the first thing that we're going to discuss. And unfortunately, GCSE is not just something that you did last year and can now forget about, because most medical schools and dental schools have certain minimum requirements in terms of what GCSEs grades you got, and they're pretty much non-negotiable. So if you haven't got those particular grades as a minimum, they won't even look at your application, no matter how brilliant your UCAT score, no matter how much you've done to save the world in your spare time. If you don't have those GCSE grades, they won't look at you. So you need to know about those minimum requirements and make sure you tick the boxes. In addition, some medical schools and dental schools also sort of give you a score on what your GCSE grades were over and above just having got the minimum. So that at some places, so long as you've got the 6s or 5s or whatever it is they're looking for, they then don't care about your GCSEs anymore. But at other places they do, and they will give you a score. So if you've got a bunch of 9s, you'll get a bigger score than somebody who's got a bunch of 7s, and that will then in those places greatly increase your chances of getting an interview. So again, you need to know about these things, and it's very complicated because everywhere does it differently. So the good news from your point of view is that that's what we know about. So we can help you make sure that you tailor your application to places where you have a decent shot at getting in. So we'll just have a quick look at some of these GCSE requirements this morning. But the point about this is not for you to take all this information on board, because apart from anything else, it was true last year, but it may not be true next year because they won't have published what their requirements are for next year yet, and they do sometimes change. So it's not about the detail here that you're going to be really concerned, but it's just to get a feeling for the kind of issues that you're going to need to be ready to think about. So this is for some medical schools. We'll look at some dental schools a bit later. So it's a slightly complicated table, but what you've got across the top are GCSE science, maths, and English, first of all. When it says science, that's either double science, if that's what you did, or, again, it varies between universities. Sometimes it's any two sciences if you did single subjects, but more commonly it's biology and chemistry that they look at. So what that's saying is that for Aberdeen, on the top row there, you needed to have a minimum of 2 6s in sciences and a minimum of 6 in maths and 6 in English. English means English language rather than literature, usually. And if you don't have those, they won't then look at your application any further. And that's usually pretty much non-negotiable. If you had stuff going on in life which affected your GCSE performance, a few universities have sort of special circumstances consideration. So it's maybe possible to get them to waive those things, but normally they're pretty reluctant and they just say, oh, well, you should have appealed to the exam board at the time, which is kind of obnoxious, but that's what they tend to do. So just looking down that list, you can see that 6s are the most common requirements for those things. A few places are more relaxed than that. So Exeter, for example, you can see down towards the bottom, only requires 4 in maths and English and has no specific science requirement. So they just don't care so much about GCSEs as most places do. But that doesn't mean Exeter's easy to get into. They'll just have different high hurdles that you have to get over. But obviously, the existence of places like that is important for those of you who've got slightly checkered GCSE profile. Bristol, actually, that's a misprint on there. It should say 7 for maths is right, but it's only 4 for English for Bristol. So again, that's kind of important to know. If you have had a bad day in your English language, there are some universities where you can get away with not having a 6, just not that many of them. In addition to that, some of them have a sort of more wide-reaching requirement. So you can see that the second row down, Anglia Ruskin, has those minimum 6s in science, maths and English, but overall they're required to have at least 5 6s. So there would have to be another 6 in your profile as well. And other places that's tougher. So Cardiff require 9 GCSEs at least grade 6. So again, you need to know those things, because if you just haven't got that, then you have to look elsewhere in deciding where to apply. Cambridge, I haven't put it on there because they don't have any specific requirements, but Oxford and Cambridge actually look very hard at your GCSEs, and most people who succeed in getting into Oxford and Cambridge will have mainly 9s in their GCSEs. If you're from Wales, I should clarify, 8 and 9 means A star in most places, but Oxford and Cambridge only treat 9 as an A star. So 6s, which is the common grade there, is B in Wales. 7 is A in Wales. So that's what you're looking at. So all those 6s would mean you need to have a minimum of Bs in those things. But like East Anglia there, you can see is looking, and Edinburgh looking for a bunch of 7s. That means As if you're from Wales. There's a lot to think about there. But as I say, the good news is that we know about these things. So when you're come up with your short list of where you want to apply it, I'll scrutinize it and say, this doesn't look like a good idea to me because, and then in the end, it's up to you, of course, but I can at least advise you that you're likely to fall at that hurdle. The last column is making this point that some of them, in addition to having this minimum requirement, sort of score you on your total, and all those that have a yes there have some kind of scoring system. And again, you're going to need to know what that system is in order to decide whether you're likely to be competitive there. And they're all different. That's just more of the same for some other medical schools. But this is an example of a scoring system. So if you apply to Leicester, they look at your English, maths, and 2 sciences, and they give you a score for your grade in that. So you get 4 points if you've got a 9, 3 points if you've got an 8, and so on. You can see on the right-hand side there. They also look at your 4 other best GCSEs, regardless of what subject they were, any 4 GCSEs. If you did BTECs, again, you need to be careful because some medical schools will consider them and some won't. So if you've got a lot of BTECs in your profile, again, that's something we're going to need to talk about and make sure you choose wisely and where to apply. But if you, assuming you've got GCSEs, they take your next best 4, and again, they give you a score based on those. And then they'll add that total score to a score based on your UCAT result to give you some number, and then they'll just rank people according to that total score. And they'll take, you know, the best 500 or however many they're prepared to interview. So for those kind of places, you need to know what the scoring system is, because you can usually find out what the cutoff was, you know, last year and the year before, which gives you a reasonable guideline as to what you're going to need to get. And if you're way below it, then you think, right, this wouldn't be a good choice of somewhere to apply. Whereas if you're over it, then it might well be that it is. So again, you can see that your particular profile is going to work for you better in some places than others. Dentistry, just looking at that list, you can see that they tend to be slightly stricter in terms of GCSE requirements. So there are quite a lot of places looking for a bunch of 7s. So Manchester is the worst. You see, to be considered even for dentistry, you need to have at least 7 7s at Manchester, which is 7 A's if you've got Welsh GCSEs. But it's not quite as bad as that everywhere else. So again, this is going to be important as part of your decision as to where to apply. They also, some of them, have GCSE scoring systems. They're less good about telling you what those systems are. The medical schools tend to get so many people putting in sort of freedom of information requests and things like that, that they've got sort of bullied into releasing the details of what their systems are. Dental schools seem to get away with it a bit more, and they just say vague things like, you know, we will then consider your overall GCSE profile without telling you exactly how they score it. So it's a bit harder with dental schools to play that game. Okay, but again, you can see it varies. Some of them, like Bristol, hardly care about your GCSE. So long as you've got those maths and English requirements, it doesn't matter what you've got for everything else. So you just have to try your best to play the game to suit what your profile is. But that's going to be important nearer the time. Okay, so that's the GCSE picture. If anybody is concerned about their GCSE profile, having seen that, and are thinking it didn't look to me like there were many places I would be able to apply, then you need to let me know, and we can have a meeting and have a look in detail at that and check that there are some possibilities out there. But usually we can find some way forward. Okay, second thing to talk about then is this other stuff that you're doing in your spare time. So work experience in the sense of shadowing, volunteering, and all your other activities. These things come into play basically at 3 stages in the application. The first is the personal statement. So this is part of the UCAS application thing. When you apply, you have to apply through this national system called UCAS, which all university applications go through. And part of UCAS is that you have to write a personal statement. This has changed this year. In the past, it was just a blank page that you had to write whatever you wanted about yourself in. This year, they're asking specific questions, which are, why do you want to do this course? How do you think your studies have helped prepare you for this course? And what else have you done to prepare for it? And my feeling for dentistry and medicine is that you're going to want to say a fair amount about why you want to do it, almost nothing about your subjects. You'll have to say something, but they're not very interested in that, but loads about what else you've done. Okay, because for medicine and dentistry, they're not very interested in what you're doing in your A-levels. So you're going to get very different advice than the people going to the mainstream reach classes who will be told, oh, you have to write in detail about, you know, how you think what you've studied in chemistry is going to help you in your future degree course. Medical schools don't care about that kind of stuff. All they care about is that they're going to need you to get an A, or possibly an A-star in that subject. And they just take the view that if you can do that, then you're smart enough to be able to cope with the academic content of the course. But they're not really interested in what you thought about chemistry or what you thought about biology. They just want to see that you get the grade. What they do care about is whether you're going to be good at working with people. And so the bit of the personal statement that matters most is that third bit. What else have you done to prepare for it? And that means talking about volunteering and stuff like that. So it's really important at the personal statement stage. Some universities, because the personal statement doesn't ask very specific questions, they will send out their own questionnaires. Only a few do this, but some do. And then you've got a whole bunch of other questions that you have to answer. And some of them, like Liverpool, for example, will base their decisions about who they interview partly on how well you answer these questionnaires. So some of the questions are similar, you know, about motivation and things like that, but they ask weird questions as well, just to see how good you are at reflecting on yourself particularly. So a couple of years ago, for example, Bristol have a questionnaire like this. I can't remember if it was medicine or dentistry, one of them. And the question was, how would somebody who doesn't like you describe you? Okay, so this is just a weird question, but it's about saying, are you good at reflecting on yourself and, you know, appraising yourself honestly and things like that, you know, and that's quite hard. But again, that's just a taste of the kind of stuff that comes up at interview anyway. And then the interview itself, which is the final hurdle. If you've got through all these earlier ones, the interview is where they make the final decisions about who gets offers. And again, unless you apply to Oxford or Cambridge, they won't ask you any science questions at all at interview. They will ask you entirely questions about yourself and about working with people, because they want to try to decide whether you're going to be good at you know, empathizing with your patients, at working in a team with your colleagues and all that kind of stuff. And you know, you can be quite skeptical about whether an interview really tells them about that, but that's what they're trying to achieve, because those are the kind of questions that they're going to answer. And the more of this stuff you've done, the easier it is to cope with those interview questions, because it's much more convincing if you can quote evidence. You know, from my experience, I know that this is what makes a team work, because I can tell you about the team that I work in and either why it didn't work or why it did work. That's much more convincing than just talking theoretically about things. So the more of this stuff you've got to talk about, the better. So here's an example. This is from Manchester's prospectus. This is last year's. Obviously, this year's ones are not available yet. So some universities will change from year to year. So we'll need to look at the up-to-date ones nearer the time, but most of these things don't change very much. So they're sort of saying that they want experience in a caring role, and they're quick to point out that doesn't necessarily mean shadowing. Some universities are more forthright than that, and they say we don't care about shadowing. What they mostly care about is what hands-on stuff that you've done, rather than just watching doctors or dentists doing what they do. So it's important to be aware of that there is a difference there, and usually the volunteering is more important. So if you're applying for medicine, if you can get time spent watching a doctor do what they do, it's probably worthwhile. Partly because you have to make sure that this is what you really want to do with the rest of your life. This is a big decision. You shouldn't drift into it. If you spend time with them thinking, I would hate doing that for the next 40 years, then, you know, think about alternative careers. But for that reason, it may be worth doing. And it does have to be clear when you get to the interview stage that you have a realistic view of what life as a doctor is going to be like. You know, if it's based off, you know, sitcoms and soap operas and stuff, you're not going to have a realistic view, and they need to see that you have that you realize there are going to be horrible days mixed in with the really rewarding days. You know, days when people die, not so much when you're a dentist, hopefully, but you know, there will be days like that, and you've got to say, yeah, I realize that, and you know, these are the things that I think will help me cope with it, and then these are the positives that in the end for me override it. So it's worth doing, but it doesn't matter if you can't arrange it. For dentistry, that's a bit more mixed. For some universities, they actually require shadowing for dentistry. None of the medical schools do, but some of the dental schools do. Newcastle is the worst. They require 2 weeks, so 10 days of experience shadowing dentists. Most places it's much less than that. That's okay. Some, what was that? Oh, yeah, Birmingham is a bit tricky. They only require, I think, 4 days, possibly even 3 days, but it has to be at a dental practice which does NHS work. And if you know anything about NHS dentistry, you know that those are really hard to find these days because nearly all dentists have gone private. So again, you have to check the requirements, make sure you tick those boxes. But some dental schools are also now, like the medical school, saying, well, it's optional. Good thing to do, gives you a realistic view of the career, but it's not the end of the world if you can't arrange it. But the hands-on caring is what everybody needs to have. Some places like Manchester here is sort of saying that you have to actually specify, you know, where you did it and how much time you spent doing it. A few places do that. Most of them don't. But it will be clear from the way you answer questions if you've done lots of it. And that's what they like, because then you're really talking from your own experience, not just from a theoretical view about what it takes to be an effective carer and whether you've got the attributes that tick those boxes, basically. So volunteering is going to be massively important. Hobbies and interests are worth mentioning as well, because sometimes people sort of start to feel the pressure at about this stage in sixth form, and they think, oh, I better start giving up some of this extra stuff I do in my spare time because I'm not going to have time to do all my work and my volunteering otherwise. But if you possibly can keep your other activities going, then you should. Partly because it's good for your sanity to have other stuff going on, but also because they actually like to see this image of someone who's got so much energy and organization that they can do well academically and do volunteering and still keep their other activities going. Because again, it gives you more stuff that you can talk about. And if you know, it depends what your activities are, but if they involve any kind of interaction with other people, then again, they're really useful for some of those kind of interview questions. So if you play team sports, then obviously any questions about teamwork and stuff, it gives you something to talk about. If you can take on responsibility within any of your other activities, that's really important. So if, for example, you know, you have a part-time job or whatever, if any chance comes up to take on a little bit of extra responsibility within that, then take it, because responsibility is one of the things they ask you about. So, you know, it's like if a new person joins you and you can say, can I help train them or something? That's really good. If you're involved in sport, you know, can you get involved in coaching younger people and that kind of stuff? Because that responsibility is stuff that ticks boxes when it comes to interviews and so on. So don't lightly give up the other stuff you do, especially if it involves interaction with people, because it really helps make your profile stronger overall. And then when we talked about team working, and in the end, they're going to want you to sound motivated. So as I say, it's this, that any suspicion they have that you've just drifted into this, you need to be able to dispel. Okay, because you've got to sound like you're incredibly well informed, and this is the only thing you want to do with your life, basically, when you get to the interview stage. So as far as volunteering goes, just before we move on to this, if you've already got it organized and you're confident that you're doing enough, then that's brilliant. If you've got some organized but you're not confident that it's enough, then come and talk to me about it and we can have a look at that. If you haven't got started at all, then you need to get started as soon as possible at this point, getting something organized. Because it doesn't happen very quickly. You know, you can't sort of apply to some place this week and expect to start next week. It usually takes weeks and weeks for them to get paperwork sorted out and so on. So the sooner you can get going on organizing some sort of volunteering, the better. For medicine or dentistry, it's the same stuff. Anything involving working with people, it doesn't have to have any direct relationship to medicine, is good. The hospital does have a scheme, which is a good one that you can do, which you can apply for, but it's quite a big commitment. I think you have to sign up for 6 months, certainly several months, you know, coming along once a week to do that. But that's a good scheme. You can apply to things like care homes, nursing homes. Some of them will just say no. Since COVID, a lot of them have been very nervous about taking people, but some of them won't. And sometimes you have to be persistent, because unless you get through to the people who actually run them, often your request will just get lost in the system somewhere. So you need to make sure you sort of get to the top when you're applying to those places, but they can be really good. The hospice, sometimes takes people. Again, it depends on, you know, whether they need people. They won't sort of feel under an obligation to take anybody who applies, but if they need people, they do take people from this college, and that's a really great experience. Obviously, it can be quite stressful because you're then spending time looking after people who are in their last days, and you know that can be emotionally quite challenging, but that's good experience to have, because apart from anything else, it helps you decide, do I want to have a career where I'm going to have lots of this? So they may be worth considering. Hello. No, I think it's R103. I think. And there are various sort of charities that work with people with various. Oh, okay, okay, right. I'm sure you learned something useful along the way. Yeah, there are charities like Headway is a good one. Headway is a charity for people who've had traumatic brain injuries, so they're trying to sort of get their lives back together and rehabilitate themselves, and so they spend a lot of time, you know, learning to relate to people again and stuff like that. So they will sometimes take students from here to help with those kind of things. Again, that can be very challenging, you know, working with people who've sort of forgotten the basic rules of how to talk to people, so who might well shout at you and behave irrationally and things. But it's great experience to talk about. So those kind of things are worth considering. There are play schemes for children with disadvantages or disablements that operate in the summer. There's a thing called March's Family Network that organises those. That's a really good thing to do. So have a think about that. Get organised on it. Come and talk to me about it if you're not sure that you're doing the right kind of stuff, but get going on it soon, because the more you've done, the more confident you're going to feel going into an interview that you can convince them that you're not just talking theoretically about this, but you really understand it. Okay, so aptitude test. This is, sorry, I should have updated my slides. This is out of date. All medical schools, including Oxford and Cambridge, now require you to take this UCAT test. They used to have a separate system of their own, but that's now gone. So all medical schools and all dental schools require the UCAT test. So that's going to be one of the things we're going to spend a fair amount of time on in this course, because it's a big hurdle. So it's an online test. So you don't take it in college, and you don't sign up for it through college either. So nearer the time, you can't sign up for it till June, but nearer the time, you have to individually sign up for this test, and you take it at some kind of online test centre like the one in Hereford where they do the driving theory tests. I should say, I apologise that all of this stuff has been very Hereford centric. I know that some of you come from further away. There are obviously equivalent volunteering opportunities. In Wales, for example, they have very good hospital-based scheme there called Ffrindiau Ni. So again, you can find out about that if you're not local to Hereford. And again, with these UCAT tests, you know, you can do them in Worcester and Cardiff and wherever as well. So it's all electronic. There's no writing or anything, and there's no science. Okay, so they're not interested in what you've learned today level. They're asking sort of general intelligence questions, and mainly their focus seems to be on how quickly you think. So UCAT is a massive race against time, generally speaking. So what we can do in these sessions is introduce the kinds of questions that you're going to have to deal with. And that's really all we can do. What that will hopefully mean is that when you start working on them independently, you won't look at the questions thinking, I've no idea where to begin, because we'll have hopefully got past that stage. But you will then have to get good at it yourself and get quick at it yourself. So it is, you know, it's very much like learning to play a musical instrument. You know in principle what you have to do to play the piano on day one, but you don't stop getting good at it ever, because the more you practice, the better you get at it. And in the case of UCAT, it's not just better, but quicker, because the people who score really well on it are people who've just trained themselves to do it almost as a reflex thing, so that it becomes really fast. And that's going to be your mission in the summer. So they will set you off on that road by making sure you know what the kind of questions are, but then it will be down to you to put the time in. You know, we're probably going to spend maybe 3 sessions on that, so that will be 3 hours of preparation, but you're probably looking at doing 300 hours of preparation by the time you actually do the exam. So lots and lots of practice. Okay, so again, this is slightly out of date. It says there are 5 sections. There are actually now only 4 sections. So they have dropped the abstract reasoning one. The reason they dropped it is, interestingly, that they said, oh, we did some research to look at how useful these tests are at predicting how well you'll do subsequently in your medical career. And they said, oh, we found that there was no evidence that the abstract reasoning was a good predictor of how well people would do in medical school or in the sort of various exams that come later on in your career. Therefore, we've dropped it. And the reality is that actually the evidence suggested that none of these things is a very good predictor of how well you'll do in medical school. The abstract reasoning was just the worst, so they've dropped that one. But they're all kind of rubbish. The only one that had any significant correlation with how well people did in, for example, if you're going into medicine, long after you've qualified, or sort of in the 3 or 4 years after you qualified, you have to do professional exams, MRCP, MRCS, these kind of things. And they looked at the correlation between UCAT scores and your chance of passing MRCP first time. And they found that the only one of these that had any significant correlation was verbal reasoning. Verbal reasoning is where they give you a passage of text and then ask you some questions about it. And the reason that correlates is that they ask you easy questions, but they expect you to answer them incredibly fast. So basically, the verbal reasoning is a test in how quickly you read and digest information. And obviously, that is important in preparing for exams. So that's why that thing. But I wanted to highlight the fact that I hate UCAT. I think it is a terrible, terrible way to select medics and dentists. It would be scrapped if I had any power, which of course I don't. But you have to live with it. But all you need to do is think, right, I've got to train myself to do this, because if I don't, I won't get into medical school. But if you find it hard, or if you just scrape over and get a score that's just high enough, but you think, oh, that's pretty rubbish compared to lots of other people, you shouldn't think that means I'm going to be a terrible doctor or a terrible dentist, because, as I say, the evidence is that there is no correlation whatsoever. So don't take it to heart if you find UCAT difficult. You have to grit your teeth and train yourself to get better at it, but it's no indicator of what your aptitude actually is. And I think that's really important, because sometimes it gets people down and makes them think, oh, why am I struggling with this? Because if it's telling me I'm going to always struggle, but it isn't, it won't. So just grit your teeth, do it, and then forget about it. Okay, so how do they use UCAT? Well, unfortunately, again, just like with the GCSEs, it varies hugely. But they all use it to some extent to whittle down the numbers, because the bottom line is that a huge number of people apply and they haven't got the time to interview them all. So it just gives some examples there. So Newcastle, 2022, so a couple of years old, these data, but it's similar every year. So they had 6 applications for every place, and they probably have something like 200 places. So they can't interview 1,200 people. It's just going to take too much of their time to do that. So they want to have a way of whittling down that number, and a lot of them will use UCAT for that, along sometimes with GCSEs. So you can see for Newcastle, they actually only interviewed 1/3 of the people who applied there. Some of those would have fallen at the GCSE minimum hurdle, because not everybody reads the prospectuses, but most of them would have fallen at the UCAT hurdle. And it's similar in most places. It's always something like 1/3 or even fewer of the people who apply there. So that's why these tests are so important. They're not just kind of getting rid of a few people at the bottom end. They're getting rid of the majority of people even before you get to the interview stage. So you've got to be well prepared for these things. So here's some examples. So this is from data 2 years ago, I think. And you can see that if you look at all the people in the country who did UCAT and add up their total scores, they formed a nice sort of normal distribution like this. And each bar is a decile, so D1 is the bottom 10% and so on. And you might think, oh, well, you probably need to be in the top half of that to be a contender, you know, better than average. But actually, it's not as comfortable news as that. So this is an example. So this is Liverpool. And you can see that in order to secure an interview at Liverpool, as well as meeting their GCSE minimum, you had to be in about the top 28% or so of people. So pretty much the top quarter of people. Otherwise, you just didn't get an interview. So you didn't have any chance to wow them with your understanding of people's skills and all that kind of stuff, because you just didn't get an interview. So UCAT's really important. Manchester is slightly tougher. Again, same sort of system, but just because they have either fewer places or more people applying or whatever, you had to be in the top 20% to get a chance of interview. In Newcastle, worse still, you had to be in about the top 11%. That's really tough. So, you know, if you take 10 people randomly from around the country, you have to be better than 9 of them to get a chance of an interview at Newcastle. Bristol is even worse. Bristol, you had to be in the top 9% last year to get an interview. Okay, so it's incredibly tough. And you're going to have to do loads of preparation. You know, some of you will find it easier than others, but everybody can get good at it if you practice. You shouldn't believe, you know, it's like all the nonsense about IQ tests where they tell you, oh, you know, it just tells you how bright you are. You can't train yourself to do well at it. Everybody knows you can, and same with these. So if you put the time in, you can be good enough, not necessarily to get in the top 10%, I mean, but to get into you know, those places where it's top 20 to 30%, it can be done. Right, choosing where to apply. So this is really complicated because there are so many things that you can think about. So the way the system works is that all medical dental school applications have to be done through UCAS, which is the same system that everybody applying for university uses. And everybody gets 5 choices on their UCAS application. But the bizarre thing is that if you apply for medicine or dentistry, only 4 of those can be for that course. So one thing to think about is what do you do with the 5th one? So, you know, you might have 4 medicine applications. The 5th one can't be medicine. Some people just leave it blank because they think, well, there isn't anything else I want to do, so there's no point in putting that down. But generally speaking, it's quite a good idea to have a backup plan, because you have to think, what am I going to do if I just have a bad day on my A-levels and I don't get the grades? And if you haven't put anything down as a 5th one, you've then got to reapply for something else the following year. Whereas if you have put a 5th one down, you might be able to step straight into, you know, whatever your plan B is. And I know nobody wants to think about plan B because you want to focus on this is what I really want to do. But there's something to be said for having that security of, well, even if things don't go to plan and I don't get the grades or I don't get any offers, I've got this that I can at least consider doing as a backup thing. And it can be anything. You know, you can, you know, go and study the cello at conservatoire or something if you want to. More commonly, people will choose something scientific because that's often where their interest in medicine or dentistry comes from. So biomedical science or biochemistry or physiology or something you can do. And one advantage of doing those is that having got that degree, it then gives you a second chance, because quite a lot of the dentists and doctors who train in this country train as graduate students, having already done a degree in something else. And sometimes that's because they just didn't get in first time round. Sometimes it's just because their ideas change. So one of my own kids, for example, did chemistry as a first degree and did very well at it, but then announced that he hated chemistry and decided he wanted to do something different. So he's now training to do medicine. And he reckoned that I think about a quarter of the students in this is just a normal medical school class, a quarter of them are graduates, and then there are some specific courses for graduates as well. So it's not the end of the road if you don't get in first time. Same with dentistry. But if you do something biomedical, biological like that, it makes it easier to get into those graduate entry things. So think about that. Not the main thing you're thinking about, but it's worth spending a few minutes. Right, how much choice do you have? Well, in principle, there are, I think it's slightly more than 37 now because there are a couple of new ones, but it's about 39, I think, medicine courses to choose from. However, some of those are in Scotland, and you have very little chance of getting in there because they have a rather small quota of English students that they take. They will take mainly Scottish students and EU students. So they have very few places for English students. So don't apply to Scotland would be my advice. Also, on a similar vein, Cardiff is great if you live in Wales and almost no chance if you live in England. So again, it cuts down the possibilities a bit, but there's still a lot of choice. So how are you going to decide which of those 30 odd to apply for? Dentistry, it's a smaller choice. Again, 3 of those are in Scotland, so it's really 11 that you're choosing between if you're going to have a realistic chance. So when you go to open days, and it is worth going to a few open days later in the year just to see what these places are actually like. And they will talk a lot about the way they teach the subject. And each individual medical school will claim that they've got the perfect balance of, you know, when you do your clinical experience as opposed to you know, learning the theoretical stuff and you know, how your learning is organized. Do you have lots of lectures or is it much more independent learning and all this kind of stuff? And you can think about that quite a lot and think that will suit me less and so on. It's also worth looking at the places and saying, well, you know, is this a city I'd like to live in? Because remember, you'll be there for at least 5 years. So that's probably quite important. But actually, that's not the most important question. So what's the most important question? Well, the most important question is that, because we have to keep coming back to the fact that there are 3.5 applicants for every place. So most people don't have the luxury, to be honest, of saying, right, you know, I want to go to the place that has the course whose structure best suits me, or you know, which has the best nightclubs in the city or whatever it might be. You don't have that luxury. You have to just say, where am I going to get in, and make sure you apply to those places. And that's, I think, for most people, what counts. The good news is that it doesn't matter where you go, and that's hugely important. Okay, so you can go to Oxford, you can go to, you know, one of the very new medical schools like Brunel or something, and older people will say, oh, that's not going to have the prestige, that's going to hold you back in your future career. But that is nonsense. It doesn't matter where you go, because what happens at the end of your 5 years is that you have to apply for foundation training, which is your first 2 years of training, and that is allocated randomly. So it doesn't matter where you studied in your medical school, where you get to do your foundation training. When you put down your preferences, but who gets their first choice and who gets their second choice is done randomly. It doesn't depend on where you studied. And once you've done your foundation training, your future prospects depend basically on how well that goes, not on what happened at medical school. So you don't have to worry about it in terms of prestige, because it makes no difference. And that's why it's legitimate to say, where am I going to get in should be your focus. Right, application process, say, goes through UCAS. Later in the year, you'll get some lessons from the careers department about how to complete the UCAS application. And some people decide they've got better things to do and skip those lessons. That is a very bad idea. Okay, you should go to those lessons because you have to get UCAS done in a very short time. Okay, you're back here mid-September. The actual deadline for application for medicine dentistry is the middle of October, but because we need time to process them, realistically, it's the beginning of October. So you've got basically 2 to 3 weeks when you get back to get your application sorted out. And if you don't know where to start, that can become quite stressful. So make sure you know about the UCAS process. And as I say, going to those careers lessons is a good way to do that. So the form is quite a long form you have to fill in. A lot of it is just filling in all the details about yourself and your grades in previous exams and all this kind of stuff. You also have to do a personal statement, which, as we mentioned earlier, is where you get a chance to talk about your volunteering and your motivation and so on. And the form also has a reference and grade predictions which come from the college. We'll just say a little bit about those. The reference is written mainly by your subject teachers, and then I had a paragraph on the end about your volunteering and all that kind of stuff, and just what a great person you are. So it's important not to fall out with your teachers, because they will have to write this bit of in your reference about what you're doing. And so making sure that you do your best in your subject, but also about being positive in lessons and things like that. So contributing in lessons if you can, asking questions, volunteering answers, just being positive makes a difference, because they'll say nicer things about you in your reference if you do that. And grade predictions, have they started threatening you with grade predictions already? They will soon. They'll start saying, oh, well, if you don't revise for these tests, you'll get your comeuppance in the autumn, because we have to predict what grade you're going to get in your A-levels. So the end of year exams particularly are important, because they will look, first of all, at what you got in that when they're thinking about what grade to predict you, but they'll probably also look at your performance throughout the year. And they're not stupid. They know that people can put their foot on the gas a bit more in the second year and improve and things like that. So you shouldn't think, oh, I got a B in my end of year exam, so I can't get predicted an A, because you can, so long as you show that you've got a positive approach to the subject and they can realistically believe that you're going to really improve in the second year. But you've got to give them some evidence to base that on. So don't get panicked about the end of year exams. If you underperform in them, it's not necessarily the end of the world, so long as your teachers have a positive view of you, so that they can think, yeah, you are going to get better in the second year. But it's really important to not ignore that issue. If you get a B and you say, but I need an A prediction, they'll almost certainly give it to you. If you've got a C and you need an A prediction, then if you've been positive, you've done well in some earlier tests, they'll probably give it to you. But if you've got an E and you need an A prediction, they're going to laugh. Okay, so you've got to get your act together and not get distracted by all the stuff we're going to be talking about here, and forget that the most important thing is getting your A-level grade sorted out. So yeah, that's something to keep in mind. Personal statement, we'll talk more about later. Some medical schools make use of it, some don't. But even if they don't, it's a useful process, because that process of reflecting on your volunteering and on your motivation and that kind of stuff is something you're going to need to do anyway in preparation for the interview. And so I tend to think that the personal statement is almost more useful for that, for sort of focusing your mind on how you're going to present yourself at interview, than it is for itself, because most medical schools don't really make much use of it. But a few do, so it's got to be good anyway. But it's definitely a worthwhile process, and it takes time. So what we will do is I will suggest to you that you start working on it during the summer, because you can send me drafts through the summer, and if you come back in September with it almost done, it just makes your life so much easier. If you haven't started, you've got to basically go from nothing to something highly polished in 2 weeks, and that can be quite tough going. So thinking about it in good time is really an important part of the preparation. And then if you get over all of these hurdles, so you do well enough in UCAT, your GCSEs are good enough, depending on where the universities are, then you get yourself an interview. And the interesting thing is that at most places, at that point, they wipe the slate clean. So in other words, it makes no difference whether you were top in the entire country in UCAT or whether you just scraped over the borderline. It's a level playing field once you get to interview. There are a couple of places where that's not true, and that again is important to know about when you're making choices, and that's what we can help you with. But at most places, it's a level playing field, and that's good news. If your GCSEs are slightly dicey, if your UCAT's slightly dicey, doesn't matter once you get to the interview stage. So you can then got the same chance to wow them as everyone else does. And interview is all about convincing them of your motivation and of your people skills. So we'll just look at a few of the kinds of questions you get at interview, but we'll talk much more about this in some later sessions. So you often get very general questions, sometimes as general as why do you want to do medicine, or what do you think are the qualities that make a good dentist, that kind of thing. And those are the things they will expect you to have thought about. You know, if they say, why do you want to do medicine? You can't say, oh, I haven't ever really thought about that. I mean, obviously, you're going to immediately not get in if you do that. They need to see that you've really thought this through thoroughly. But that doesn't mean that you should have a prepared speech. Prepared speeches are always awful. So it's about getting that balance so that you know what you're going to talk about, but actually you do it off the cuff in the interview. Because the more natural you sound, the more conversational you sound, the better you come across. So you've got to be careful with the preparation on this. It's about lots of preparation in terms of knowing the kind of stuff you've got to talk about, but not practicing it word for word, because that's always bad. Then you get questions like this, which are a bit more specific, but still very general. You know, what have you done to prepare for your stuff? And again, just the more volunteering and stuff you've done, the easier it's going to be to give an interesting answer to that question. So those kind of questions usually, so long as you've done quite a lot of preparation, are not too bad. Then you get some more specific ones like this. So tell me about a difficult situation that arose during your volunteering, and do you think it was sorted out effectively? So again, the more you've done, the better. But that's really about asking, are you good at being self-critical? Because lots of people, if they get a question like that, will sort of dodge that issue and kind of talk about something that was difficult, but where none of it was your fault. And it's much better if you can kind of say, well, looking back, I realize I could have handled this better, and this is what I've learned from it, and this is what I'm going to do differently in the future. And that's actually much better than just talking about something where you were kind of a neutral observer. Because when you get to medical school, dental school, they will expect you to learn from your mistakes, because nobody is just brilliant at everything. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to find things that you just are a bit rubbish at to start with, and you need to be able to reflect on how you're going to get past that problem. And if you show that you do that naturally by talking about it at this stage, that gets you ahead of the game in interviews. So those kind of questions, again, it's really hard on the spur of the moment to think about, what should I talk about, what should I not talk about. So you think in advance, yeah, I'd be really happy to talk about that thing that I didn't do all that well, because I've learned from it and I can talk about how I've learned from it. But don't make up a speech. And then you get really personal questions. What did you learn about yourself from your work experience? And they'll often ask that either generally like that, or in relation to specific things, like how good are you at empathizing with people? How good are you at managing the dynamics of working in a team, this kind of thing. So again, these are all things that you should reflect on. So when you're doing your volunteering, try to keep some notes. When something happens, just jot it down, reflect on it, and think, what did I learn from this? Because otherwise you may forget about things that would actually be really useful, because you need to go into the interview with this bank of things that you're ready to talk about. And if you keep notes as you go along, it will just help you be prepared for all of that.